What if a moment of public humiliation was the spark that ignited a revolution? This isn't just a story about a bad day at the airport. This is the story of how a single degrading comment, a TSA agent calling a black woman suspicious, unleashed a storm of karmic justice that would shake an entire industry. She wasn't just any traveler. She was Imani Jackson, the incoming CEO of the very airline she was flying, and her journey through security that morning was about to become the first item on her agenda. What he thought was an act of power was the biggest mistake of his life. The air in Terminal 4 of New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport had a texture. It was a thick, chaotic tapestry woven from the scents of stale Cinnabon jet fuel and the collective low-grade anxiety of thousands of people in transit. It was 6:05 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the security line for Zenith Airlines snaked back and forth in a miserable grey-carpeted corral. For Imani Jackson, it was just another threshold to cross, one of countless she had navigated in her 42 years. Dressed in a sharply tailored but comfortable navy blue blazer, a simple silk shell and dark trousers, she looked like what she was, a seasoned executive who knew how to travel. Her luggage was minimal, a sleek graphite-colored roller bag, and a leather satchel that held her life. She exuded a quiet confidence, an aura of someone who belonged in the priority lane she stood in. She didn't tap her foot or sigh with impatience. Instead, she used the time to mentally rehearse the key points of the introductory speech she would give to the Zenith Airlines Board of Directors the next day. Innovation, efficiency, integrity. The words felt solid, real. After a 20-year career climbing the corporate ladder in logistics and aviation management, this was the summit. Tomorrow she would officially be announced as the new Chief Executive Officer of Zenith, one of the largest carriers in the world. The thought sent a private, thrilling hum through her veins, a stark contrast to the dreary procession around her. When she finally reached the front of the line, she placed her bag and satchel onto the conveyor belt with practiced ease. She slipped her laptop into a separate bin, removed her blazer, and stepped towards the full-body scanner. It was a mundane ritual, a dance she'd performed hundreds of times. That's when she saw him. TSA officer David Miller stood by the exit of the scanner. His posture, a study in bored belligerence. He was a man in his late 50s, with a soft, doughy physique straining against the seams of his blue uniform. His eyes, small and pale, scanned each passenger not with the professional detachment of a security officer, but with the weary cynicism of a man who suspected the worst in everyone. He watched Imani approach, and a subtle shift occurred in his demeanor. It was a tightening around the mouth, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a flicker of something that Imani had learned to recognize her entire life, the switch flip of prejudice. "Ma'am, step into the scanner." He said, his voice flat, devoid of the forced courtesy other agents employed. Imani did as instructed, raising her hands to the familiar "don't shoot" pose inside the glass tube. The machine whirred and was silent. She stepped out, reaching for her blazer. "Hold on," Miller barked, holding up a hand. He stared at the screen of his monitor, a ghostly outline of her body, displayed in yellow and green. He pointed a thick finger at a small yellow box that had appeared over her hair. "What's this?" Imani's hair was styled in a series of intricate, elegant braids, coiled into a crown-like updo. It was a work of art, a symbol of heritage and style that took her stylist hours to perfect. It was also apparently a security threat. "It's my hair," she said, her voice even. "It's braided." "You got anything in there?" Miller asked, his eyes flicking from the screen to her, then back again. His tone was accusatory, as if he'd already decided she was hiding something. "No, officer. Just my hair and some hairpins to hold it in place." This was a familiar annoyance. The technology in the scanners was notoriously poor at reading textured hair and protective styles, often flagging them as anomalies. Most agents, seeing the obvious cause, would perform a quick professional pat-down of the area and send the passenger on their way. Miller, however, seemed to relish the opportunity. "We're going to have to do a full search," he declared loud enough for the passengers behind her to hear. A few people shuffled their curiosity, piqued by the unfolding drama. Imani felt a hot flush of anger, but she suppressed it. Causing a scene would only delay her further, and she had a 9:15 a.m. flight to Chicago to catch. It was a pre-meeting with the outgoing CEO, Richard Sterling. A final passing of the torch before the big announcement. A full search. For what reason? "You can clearly see it's my hairstyle. That's the protocol when there's an anomaly we can't clear." He said the word protocol weaponized. "You look suspicious." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Suspicious. It wasn't just about her hair anymore. It was about her. Her face, her skin, her very presence in this priority line was, to him, an anomaly. Imani's carefully maintained composure began to crack. She could feel the stares of the other passengers, a mix of pity, impatience, and judgment. She was being othered, singled out, and humiliated in public. "Suspicious," she repeated, her voice dropping, taking on a dangerous edge. "On what grounds?" "My hair. Or is there something else about me that you find so suspicious?" Miller's face flushed a dull red. He wasn't used to being challenged. "You're causing a scene, ma'am. Now you can either consent to a search, or we can deny you entry to the secure area." He gestured for a female agent, a younger woman named Garcia, who looked profoundly uncomfortable, to come over. "Female assist for a full pat-down and hair search," he commanded. Agent Garcia approached hesitantly. "Right here?" she asked, glancing at the long line of people watching. "Right here," Miller confirmed with a grim satisfaction. "Let's see what she's hiding." The humiliation was absolute. Agent Garcia, clearly following orders, began the pat-down. It was clumsy and invasive. But the worst part was the hair search. Garcia's gloved fingers probed and squeezed at Imani's scalp, pulling at the intricate braids. Imani stood rigid, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her eyes fixed on a Zenith Airlines promotional poster on the far wall. It showed a smiling, diverse group of people under the slogan, "Zenith, a higher standard of travel." The irony was a bitter pill. With each tug and press, Imani felt a piece of her dignity being stripped away. This wasn't about security. This was about power. It was a petty tyrant using his sliver of authority to demean someone he had prejudged. He had called her suspicious. He had no idea who he was talking to. As Garcia's fingers dug into a particularly tight braid, Imani made a silent, cold vow. This wouldn't be the end of it. Officer David Miller had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had mistaken her patience for weakness. He thought he was closing a gate on her. He was, in fact, opening a door to his own personal hell. The search concluded as it began with nothing. Agent Garcia pulled her last glove-clad finger from Imani's hair and stepped back, her expression a mixture of apology and relief. "Nothing, sir," she reported to Miller, her voice barely a whisper. Miller grunted, his disappointment palpable. He had hoped for a trophy, a validation of his instincts. Finding nothing was in his mind, not proof of Imani's innocence, but evidence of her cunning. "All right, go on," he grumbled, waving a dismissive hand at Imani, already turning his suspicious gaze to the next passenger, a flustered-looking man with a backpack. He didn't make eye contact. He offered no apology. The humiliation was delivered, and as far as he was concerned, the transaction was complete. Imani said nothing. A verbal confrontation now would be pointless, like screaming at a hurricane. The damage was done, but the war had just begun. She calmly put her blazer back on her movements, deliberate and precise. She gathered her laptop and her satchel, slid the handle of her roller bag up with a quiet click-clack, and walked away from the security checkpoint without a single backward glance. But she saw him in the reflection of a polished chrome pillar. She saw his smug, bored expression. She memorized his face. She noted the name on his badge, D. Miller. The walk to gate B34 felt like a mile. With every step, the hot flush of shame cooled into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous resolve. The eyes of strangers felt like tiny needles on her skin. Did they see a victim? Or did they, like Miller, see someone suspicious who had finally been put in her place? She ducked into a deserted restroom near the gate, leaning against the cool marble of the sink. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was slightly disheveled, a few fine strands escaping the intricate coils. Her eyes, usually bright and commanding, were shadowed with a deep, chilling fury. She took a deep breath, then another. She was Imani Jackson. She had negotiated multi-billion-dollar logistics contracts in Dubai. She had stared down union bosses in Detroit. She had shattered a glass ceiling so thick it was once thought to be a concrete bunker. She would not be broken by a petty tyrant in a badly fitting uniform. She carefully tucked the errant strands of hair back into place, adjusted her blazer, and walked out of the restroom. Her composure restored. She was no longer just a woman who had been wronged. She was a CEO with a problem to solve. And the problem was Officer David Miller and the system that empowered him. Boarding the Zenith flight was like stepping into another world. The moment her boarding pass was scanned, the harried, chaotic energy of the terminal fell away, replaced by the hushed, climate-controlled calm of the aircraft. "Welcome aboard, Miss Jackson." The flight attendant at the door, a warm-faced woman named Sarah, greeted her with a genuine smile. "Can I take your satchel for you? Your seat is 2A right this way." The first-class cabin was an oasis of muted greys and Zenith's signature sapphire blue. Imani settled into the plush leather seat, the generous space a stark contrast to the violation of her personal space just minutes earlier. Sarah returned with a pre-departure glass of sparkling water on a small tray. "We're so pleased to have you with us today, Ms. Jackson. Is there anything at all I can get for you to make your flight more comfortable?" The professionalism, the simple act of being treated with dignity, was so profound it was almost jarring. "Thank you, Sarah. This is perfect," Imani said, her voice tight with an emotion she refused to let surface. This was the standard. This was the experience every single Zenith customer deserved, from the moment they entered the airport to the moment they left. Not just the ones in seat 2A. As the plane taxied and took off, soaring above the sprawling concrete labyrinth of New York, Imani opened her laptop. She wasn't reviewing her speech anymore. She was typing a new set of notes. The document was titled Project Lighthouse. The first bullet point comprehensive review of TSA partnership and passenger complaint protocols at all Zenith hub airports, starting with JFK. Second bullet point, establish a passenger bill of rights for Zenith Airlines. Third bullet point: independent third-party audit of all discrimination and harassment claims filed against airline and affiliate personnel in the last 24 months. Fourth bullet point: D. Miller, JFK. T4. The flight to Chicago was smooth and uneventful. Imani worked the entire time, her focus absolute. The anger she felt was now being channeled, refined, and forged into a corporate strategy. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a business imperative. How many suspicious customers had Zenith lost? How many people of color, after an experience like hers, simply chose to fly with another carrier, or not at all? How could an airline that called itself a global leader tolerate such a cancer at its most critical passenger touchpoint? Upon landing at O'Hare, a black car was waiting to take her to Zenith's corporate headquarters, a gleaming glass tower in the heart of the city. As the car whisked her through the Chicago traffic, she felt the last vestiges of the victim fall away, replaced entirely by the leader. Richard Sterling met her on the 50th floor. He was exactly as he appeared in his corporate photos, tall, silver-haired, with a friendly, back-slapping demeanor that had served him well for 40 years. He was the old guard, a man who had run the airline through booms and busts, a legend in the industry. He was also, Imani knew, a man who had likely never been randomly selected for a full search in his life. "Imani, welcome," he boomed, shaking her hand warmly. "Ready for the big day tomorrow. The board is chomping at the bit to meet you properly. We're all thrilled." "I'm looking forward to it, Richard," Imani said, her smile polished professional. Good. Let's go into my office. We'll do a final run-through of the numbers, and I'll sign over the keys to the kingdom." He chuckled. His office was vast, with a panoramic view of Lake Michigan. It was a room that spoke of immense power and success. As they sat down, Sterling launched into a discussion about fuel hedging strategies and fleet acquisition plans. Imani listened intently, asked sharp questions, and demonstrated the keen financial acumen that had won her the job. Finally, as the meeting was winding down, she paused. "Richard," she began, her tone shifting slightly. "I had an experience at JFK this morning I wanted to mention." She recounted the incident with Officer Miller, not with emotion, but with the cool, factual precision of a case study. She laid out the timeline, the words used, the actions taken. Sterling listened, his brow furrowed with a kind of detached concern. "Good Lord," he said when she finished. "That's just awful. A bad apple, I suppose. There are always a few. I'm terribly sorry that happened to you of all people." He shook his head. "Well, don't you worry. Once you're in this chair, you'll never have to fly commercial again. The corporate jet is one of the better perks." Imani stared at him. His response was everything she had expected and everything she had feared. He saw it as a personal insult to her, the incoming CEO, an unfortunate anecdote. He didn't see the systemic failure, the rot. He didn't understand that the perk of a private jet was a way of avoiding the problem, not solving it. He was offering to insulate her from the very reality her customers faced. "It's not about me, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's about every single person who buys a ticket with our airline. What happened to me today wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a disease, and I intend to cure it." Richard Sterling looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He saw the fire, the intensity that the headhunters had praised. He had thought it was just ambition. He was beginning to realize it was something far more potent. It was a mission. The kingdom he was about to hand over was about to be shaken to its very foundations. The morning press release was a masterpiece of corporate communications. Zenith Airlines welcomes visionary leader Imani Jackson as new CEO. It was accompanied by a professionally shot photograph of Imani looking poised and powerful. The release quoted the chairman of the board, praising her unparalleled expertise in global logistics and her commitment to driving a new era of innovation and customer-centric growth. The market responded favorably. Zenith's stock ticked up a modest but encouraging 2 points. Internally, a company-wide email landed in the inboxes of Zenith's 80,000 employees. It was a message of optimistic transition, filled with platitudes about building on Richard Sterling's legacy, while forging a bold new future. To the baggage handlers in Denver, the gate agents in Atlanta, and the pilots crisscrossing the globe. It was just another Tuesday, another CEU, another email. But in the 50th floor boardroom of Zenith Tower in Chicago, the air was anything but ordinary. The 10 members of the board of directors were seated around a massive, polished mahogany table that gleamed under recessed lighting. They were a formidable group, mostly men, mostly white, with decades of experience in finance law and industry between them. They were the guardians of the company, the stewards of its massive wealth and influence. They were also Imani knew the first line of resistance she would have to overcome. Richard Sterling made the final introduction, his voice filled with paternal pride. And so it is with my utmost confidence and excitement that I officially hand the controls over to Imani Jackson. The company is in the best possible hands. He received a polite round of applause. He then took a seat at the side of the room, a king in voluntary exile. The chairman, a stoic man named Thomas Bainbridge, gestured to the head of the table. Imani, the floor is yours. Imani walked to the head of the table, not with a swagger, but with a quiet, grounded authority. She placed her tablet on the table but didn't look at it. She looked at each board member, making direct eye contact. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Richard, for your decades of leadership. I am honored to be here. She began, her voice calm and measured. The agenda for today, as prepared, outlines a review of quarterly performance and projections for the next fiscal year. The numbers are strong, and Richard's team has positioned us well. However, I am tabling that discussion. A few eyebrows raised. You didn't just table the financials at your first board meeting. Instead, she continued, I want to talk about the foundation upon which those numbers are built. Our brand, our reputation, our customers. Specifically, the very first experience many of them have with Zenith Airlines airport security. She saw a flicker of confusion in their eyes. This was not the kind of visionary leadership they were expecting. They were thinking about new routes to Asia, about fleet modernization, about beating their competitors on price. She was talking about the TSA line. From the corner of her eye, she saw Marcus Thorne shift in his seat. As the Executive Vice President of Operations, Thorne was responsible for the smooth running of the entire airline on the ground and in the air. He was a company man, a lifer who had started as a baggage handler 30 years ago and clawed his way to the top. He was known for his ruthless efficiency and his utter disdain for anything he considered soft or sentimental. He had been a contender for the CEO position himself and viewed Imani's appointment as an insult. Yesterday morning at JFK, Imani said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. I was publicly searched and humiliated by a TSA agent who flagged my hairstyle as an anomaly and declared me suspicious. He did this in full view of a line of our customers. He was unprofessional, abusive, and he operated with the confidence of a man who knows he will face no consequences for his actions. A stunned silence fell over the room. Richard Sterling shifted uncomfortably. This was not the smooth, celebratory handover he had envisioned. "I'm not telling you this to elicit sympathy," Imani said, quickly cutting off the murmurs before they could begin. "I'm telling you this because my experience is not unique. It is a symptom of a systemic problem that we as an airline have been complicit in ignoring. The brand promise we make on our posters and in our commercials, one of a higher standard of travel, is being broken before our customers even reach the gate." Marcus Thorne could no longer contain himself. "Imani, with all due respect," he began, his voice a low rumble, "this is a matter for the Transportation Security Administration. They are a federal agency. Our hands are tied. We can't dictate their procedures." "I'm not suggesting we dictate them, Marcus," Imani countered smoothly. "I'm suggesting we hold them accountable as a partner. I'm suggesting we hold ourselves accountable. Every time a Zenith passenger is mistreated by an agent at a security checkpoint in our terminal, our brand is damaged. Every time someone is profiled because of their race, religion, or hairstyle, it erodes the trust we ask millions of people to place in us." She clicked a button on her tablet, and the large screen at the end of the room lit up. It showed the title she had typed on the plain Project Lighthouse. "I am announcing my first major initiative today," she declared. "Project Lighthouse will be a top-to-bottom review of our passenger experience at the security threshold. We will conduct an independent audit of all passenger complaints related to TSA interactions at our 5 primary hubs. We will establish a direct, well-publicized channel for customers to report incidents of misconduct. We will create a passenger bill of rights that will be displayed at every Zenith check-in counter and gate. And we will use the data from this project to demand specific, measurable improvements from our partners at the TSA. Where they fail to meet those standards, we will explore every option, including petitioning the Department of Homeland Security to bring in a new security partner." The room was electric with tension. This was radical. Airlines didn't demand things from the TSA. They complied. They lobbied quietly. They didn't declare war in a boardroom. "This is insane," Thorne scoffed, his face reddening. "This is an expensive virtue signaling exercise that will accomplish nothing but antagonize a federal partner. Our job is to get people from point A to point B safely and on time. That's it. This is a distraction." "Is brand loyalty a distraction, Marcus?" Imani shot back, her voice like ice. "Is the lifetime value of a customer a distraction? The market is changing. Our passengers have more choices than ever. They don't just buy a seat anymore. They buy an experience. And right now, for a significant portion of our customer base, that experience begins with degradation. That's not just a soft problem. That's a threat to our long-term market share. Project Lighthouse isn't about virtue. It's about revenue. It's about survival." She paused, letting her words sink in. She looked again at each person around the table. "This is not a proposal. This is the new direction of Zenith Airlines. I have already authorized the budget for the independent audit. I expect a preliminary report from your department, Marcus, on all existing complaint data by Friday." The finality in her tone was unmistakable. She wasn't asking for permission. She was giving orders. Marcus Thorne sat back, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with fury. He had just been publicly overruled and given a direct order by a woman he believed was unqualified to run the company. He had been challenged, and in his world, challenges were meant to be broken. As the meeting concluded, the tension was thick enough to taste. Most board members offered clipped, non-committal words of acknowledgement. But one, an elegant woman in her 60s, named Eleanor Vance, who had built her fortune in tech, caught Imani's eye. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. An alliance had been silently forged. Imani Jackson had fired her first shot. The battle for the soul of Zenith Airlines had begun, and the first person in her sights, whether he knew it yet or not, was a bored, belligerent TSA agent named David Miller. The shockwaves from Imani's first board meeting radiated outward from the 50th floor, traveling through the corporate structure of Zenith Airlines with the speed of gossip. To most Project Lighthouse was a bold, if unusual, new directive. To Marcus Thorne, it was a declaration of war. He retreated to his own office, a space almost as large as the CEO's, but with a view of the bustling city rather than the serene lake, and began to plot his counter-offensive. He wasn't a fool. A direct public challenge to the new CEO on her first day would be career suicide. His approach had to be more subtle, a death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. He was a master of the system, and he would use the system to strangle Imani's pet project in its cradle. His first move was to respond to her demand for the complaint data. He called an emergency meeting with his top lieutenants in the operations and legal departments. She wants every passenger complaint related to the TSA from our 5 main hubs by Friday, he said, pacing in front of them. That's tens of thousands of records. Buried in those records are passenger names, frequent flyer numbers, contact information. It's a privacy minefield. The head of legal, a perpetually worried man named Gary, immediately took the bait. He's right. We can't just hand that over. We'd be in violation of a dozen privacy policies, not to mention GDPR, if any of those are EU citizens. We'll have to anonymize every single record. That will take weeks, maybe months. Exactly, Thorne said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Gary drew up a formal memo to Ms. Jackson's office, outlining these insurmountable legal hurdles. Emphasize our commitment to protecting our customers' data. Frame it as us protecting her from legal exposure. It was a perfect corporate checkmate. He would use the language of diligence and caution to practice the art of obstruction. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away, at JFK TSA officer David Miller was having a perfectly ordinary Wednesday. He stood at his usual post, his eyes scanning the river of humanity. The incident with the black woman with the fancy hair was completely forgotten, just one of a dozen such minor confrontations he had every week. To him, they were all the same people who didn't respect his authority, people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. Around mid-morning, his direct supervisor, a portly, balding man named Frank Henderson, walked by. Henderson was a man who managed by the principle of least resistance. As long as no one from regional headquarters was yelling at him, he considered it a good day. "Miller, keep it up," Henderson said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Heard you had to deal with a real piece of work yesterday, a suspicious one. Good job staying vigilant. These people will try anything." "Just doing my job, Frank," Miller said with a shrug. But inside he felt a swell of pride. Vigilant. That's what he was. He wasn't a bully. He was a gatekeeper. A thin blue line protecting the skies from people who looked suspicious. Henderson's praise was a fresh layer of armor for his prejudice, reinforcing his belief that his instincts were not a liability, but an asset. Back in Chicago, Imani wasn't waiting for Marcus Thorne to cooperate. She knew pushback was coming. She had hired a new chief of staff, a brilliant and fiercely loyal young lawyer named Ben Carter, whom she had mentored at her previous company. Ben was a digital native with a deep understanding of how to leverage technology and media. "He's going to stonewall us on the data," Imani told Ben in her office, anticipating Thorne's exact strategy. He'll use privacy as a shield, so we won't rely on his data. We'll generate our own. Ben's eyes lit up. A public portal. Exactly, Imani confirmed. A secure, user-friendly website and hotline advertised at every Zenith gate. Had a bad experience at security. Your voice matters. Tell us your story. We'll collect the data directly from the people who are living it, and we'll own it. No privacy arguments, no red tape. Ben was already typing on his laptop. I can have a development team on this by noon. We can have a beta version live by the end of the week. But Thorne had another card to play. He had a long-standing, mutually beneficial relationship with a veteran aviation reporter named Ken Jennings. Jennings was known for his cynical, insider take on the industry. Over a confidential lunch at a downtown steakhouse, Thorne spun his version of the story. "She's a loose cannon, Ken," Thorne said, leaning in conspiratorially. "First day on the job, she's declaring war on the TSA over a personal grudge. Something about her hair. Now she's launching this Project Lighthouse, no budget oversight, no clear objective that's going to cost millions and antagonize the very people responsible for keeping our passengers safe. The board is spooked. This isn't the steady hand they were promised. This is activism, not leadership. Shareholders should be very, very concerned." 2 days later, on Friday morning, the story dropped. The headline was devastating. Zenith's new CEO declares costly war on TSA over bad hair day. The article quoted an anonymous senior executive and painted Imani as an emotionally reactive, woke CEO on a personal vendetta. It questioned her business judgment and implied that her focus on soft issues, like passenger feelings, would come at the expense of the airline's bottom line. The story was picked up by cable news and financial blogs. Thorne's gambit had worked. The narrative was set Imani Jackson was a liability. The phone in her office began to ring. It was the chairman of the board, Thomas Bainbridge. His voice was cold. "Imani." "I'm looking at the Jennings piece," he said without preamble. "The board is getting calls. They're worried this is becoming a circus. You told us this was about revenue. This article makes it sound like a vendetta. You need to get this under control, immediately." The first shot had been fired by her, but the first real blow had been landed by her enemies. Imani sat at her desk, the city of Chicago sprawling beneath her. And for the first time since taking the job, she felt the immense, crushing weight of the forces arrayed against her. They weren't just fighting her initiative. They were fighting her. The phone call from Thomas Bainbridge ended with a sharp, definitive click, leaving a silence in Imani's office that was heavier than any sound. The article lay open on her screen, Ken Jennings' words glowing with smug accusation. Bad hair day. The phrase was designed to be trivializing, to shrink her down from a formidable executive to a hysterical woman. Marcus Thorne had chosen his weapon well. It was a classic move pulled from the oldest playbook in the corporate world. If you can't attack the argument, attack the person. Ben Carter stood by the window, his expression grim. "They're painting you as unhinged. This is a targeted assassination." Imani stared at the article, her mind working, processing, analyzing. The initial sting of the personal attack was already receding, replaced by the cold, clear logic of a strategist. She felt no panic. Panic was a luxury. What she felt was a familiar, motivating anger. Thorne and his allies thought they were playing checkers. Imani played chess. "He thinks he's set the narrative," Imani said, her voice quiet. She swiveled in her chair to face Ben. "He believes the story is now emotional CEO versus sensible board. He's wrong. He's just given us the one thing: we didn't have a national platform. Ben looked confused. A platform? They're calling you a clown. No, Imani corrected, a faint, dangerous smile touching her lips. They're calling me a human being. Thorne's mistake was in making it personal. He thinks that's my weakness. He's about to learn it's my greatest strength. She stood up and walked to the large whiteboard that covered one wall of her office. She picked up a black marker. Plan A was to fight this war from the inside using corporate channels. That was clean. It was quiet. And it was failing because Thorne controls the plumbing. So we move to Plan B. We take this fight public. We take it out of the boardroom and into people's living rooms. She wrote on the board, 1. Embrace the narrative. Thorne wants to call it a personal story. Fine, she said, underlining the words. Let's make it the most personal story this company has ever told. He wants to talk about my hair. Let's have a national conversation about what professional hair means for a black woman in 2025. Let's talk about the daily indignities that people of color face, indignities the Ken Jenningses and Marcus Thornes of the world never have to even think about. She turned back to Ben. Get me a list of the top 10 most respected female journalists in the country, not aviation reporters. I want someone from a major network. Someone known for in-depth, human-centric interviews. Someone like Evelyn Reed. Ben's eyes widened. Evelyn Reed wasn't just a journalist. She was a cultural institution. Her prime-time special conversations was famous for its thoughtful, empathetic interviews that could shape public opinion overnight. Getting on her show was nearly impossible. I'll get her contact info, Ben said, already pulling out his phone. What do we offer her? An exclusive, Imani said. The first ever sit-down interview with the new CEO of Zenith Airlines. But the topic isn't quarterly earnings. The topic is what it means to lead, what it means to be a customer, and why a bad hair day at JFK is a direct threat to Zenith's bottom line. Next, she drew an arrow from her first point to a new one. 2. Launch the lighthouse. The website, she commanded. Is it ready? Beta is live. We can push it public in an hour, Ben confirmed. Do it. But before we do, I want to add something. A video. Just me in this office, talking directly into a camera. No script, no teleprompter. I'm going to tell my story, and then I'm going to ask everyone else to tell theirs. We'll link the video to the portal. The Project Lighthouse website won't just be a complaint form. It will be a community, a testament. Within 2 hours, the plan was in motion. A formal request was sent to Evelyn Reed's producers. More importantly, Imani sat at her desk, a simple laptop camera aimed at her, and she spoke. She didn't talk like a CEO. She talked like a woman who had been humiliated. She described the feeling of the agent's gloves in her hair, the sting of the word suspicious, the averted eyes of her fellow passengers. She connected her personal experience to the broader mission of her company. My job is not just to run an airline, she said, her voice steady and sincere. It's to ensure that every single person who entrusts their journey to us is treated with dignity. What happened to me was not just an insult. It was a failure of our brand promise. I cannot and will not lead a company that accepts this as the cost of doing business. So I am asking you if you have ever been made to feel small, to feel suspicious, to feel like you don't belong while traveling. Tell us. Your story matters. Together, We will be a lighthouse guiding this industry back to a higher standard. The video titled My Story was embedded on the newly launched Project Lighthouse homepage and pushed out across all of Zenith's social media channels. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. It was as if a dam had broken. The portal was flooded. The stories poured in, not by the dozen but by the thousand. A Sikh man from Houston described being constantly pulled aside because of his turban agents demanding he unravel it in public. A mother from Chicago wrote about TSA agents forcing her to taste her own breast milk to prove it wasn't a liquid explosive. A transgender woman detailed the terror of being flagged by a body scanner that couldn't process her identity, leading to invasive questions and searches by male agents. A Muslim family wrote about being detained for hours because their father's name was similar to one on a watch list from 15 years ago. The hashtag #MyTravelStory started trending. Imani's video was viewed over 1 million times in the first 12 hours. People weren't just submitting forms. They were recording their own videos, sharing their own humiliations. Ken Jennings's article about a bad hair day was suddenly drowned out by a tsunami of genuine, raw, and painful testimony. In his office, Marcus Thorne watched the numbers climb on the Project Lighthouse website, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. His carefully crafted media hit had backfired spectacularly. He had tried to isolate Imani to make her look like a singular, irrational actor. Instead, she had used his attack to prove she was one of many building an army of aggrieved customers around her. He had handed her a sword, and she had used it to knight herself as a people's champion. The phone on his desk rang. It was an old contact of his, a deputy administrator at the Department of Homeland Security. The man's voice was frantic. "Marcus, what the hell is going on over there? My boss is getting calls from 3 different congressional offices. This Project Lighthouse thing is a nightmare. This CEO of yours, she's got half the country thinking the TSA is a rogue agency. You need to get her on a leash. Now." Thorne hung up the phone, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He had thought he was in control, but the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The narrative was no longer his. It belonged to Imani Jackson, and she was leading a revolution he had accidentally started. Evelyn Reed's producers confirmed the interview less than 24 hours after the request was sent. The national firestorm ignited by Project Lighthouse was too big a story to ignore. The interview was scheduled to be broadcast live in prime time 2 days later. For Imani, it was a chance to solidify her position. For her opponents, it was a terrifying escalation. The atmosphere inside Zenith Tower had transformed. The whispers about an emotional CEO were replaced by an awed buzz. Employees who had once seen Imani as a remote corporate figure now saw her as a champion. They forwarded the link to the Project Lighthouse portal to their friends and families. The movement was no longer just external. It was growing from within the company's own ranks. Imani spent the next 48 hours preparing not for a performance, but for a trial. With Ben and a small, trusted team, she sifted through the thousands of stories pouring into the portal. They weren't just anecdotes anymore. They were data. Ben's team began to categorize and quantify the submissions, building a damning dossier of systemic failure. The patterns were undeniable. A disproportionate number of complaints came from people of color, religious minorities, and members of the LGBTQ+ community. And one airport and one name appeared with alarming frequency: JFK Terminal 4 and Officer D. Miller. They cross-referenced the names and dates from the portal with Zenith's own flight manifests, creating verified case files. They found over 24 credible, detailed accounts of harassment and abuse, specifically naming Officer Miller stretching back for years. He wasn't a bad apple. He was a predator who had been allowed to fester in a system that protected him. The night of the interview, Imani chose her outfit with care, a simple, elegant, dark purple dress, the color of royalty and bruises. She wore her hair in the same braided updo she'd had on that fateful Tuesday. It was a silent, powerful statement. The studio lights were hot, but Imani felt cool and centered. Evelyn Reed, a woman whose calm, probing questions had unraveled politicians and celebrities, greeted her with a respectful warmth. The interview began with the expected questions about Imani's career and her vision for Zenith. Imani answered them crisply, establishing her credentials as a sharp, experienced leader. Then Evelyn leaned forward, her expression shifting. "Ms. Jackson, let's talk about Project Lighthouse," she said. "A story in the press last week described this as a costly war stemming from a bad hair day. How do you respond to that?" Imani met her gaze without flinching. "I respond by saying that reporter has no idea what a bad hair day is for millions of women who look like me. But more importantly, Evelyn, this project was never about my hair. My experience was simply the catalyst. It was the moment I realized that we, as an airline, were failing our customers at the most fundamental level. This is not about my feelings. This is about our data." That was the pivot. She had the nation's attention, and she was not going to waste it on personal grievance. "We have received over 15,000 individual stories in the last 72 hours. These are not tweets. These are detailed, painful accounts of American citizens being mistreated, profiled, and humiliated." She began to cite the statistics, the verified cases, the story of the Sikh man, the mother with the breast milk, the transgender woman. She gave them a voice on national television. "And it is not random," Imani continued, her voice resonating with authority. "Our data shows a clear pattern of targeted harassment at specific hubs. At JFK's Terminal 4, for example, we found one TSA agent, Officer David Miller, who was named in 27 separate complaints of discriminatory searches and verbal abuse over the last 3 years. 27 families who started their journey with Zenith by being subjected to his prejudice." She looked directly into the camera. "So no, this is not about a bad hair day. This is about a culture of impunity that my company will no longer tolerate being associated with." The impact was seismic. In his suburban Long Island home, David Miller was watching the interview, a half-eaten TV dinner on the table in front of him. When he heard his name, the fork clattered from his hand. His face went white. He was no longer an anonymous agent in a sea of blue uniforms. He was a named villain on national television. The walls of his comfortable, prejudiced world began to crumble. At the same time, Marcus Thorne was in his office watching on a monitor with Thomas Bainbridge and 2 other board members. Thorne's face was a thundercloud. He had been outmaneuvered at every turn. "This is a disaster," one of the board members muttered. "She just threw a federal agency under the bus on live TV." "Did she?" Eleanor Vance's voice cut through the tension. She had insisted on being present. "Or did she just present meticulously collected data that proves a clear and present danger to our brand? 15,000 complaints, gentlemen. That's not an anecdote. That's a market segment we're alienating. What is the cost of that?" Before anyone could answer, Imani delivered her final devastating move on the broadcast. Evelyn Reed asked, "So what happens now?" "What is the goal here?" "Accountability," Imani replied. "And change. I have a meeting tomorrow morning at the Department of Homeland Security in Washington, D.C. I will be presenting them with our full report. We are officially petitioning them to open a formal investigation into the practices at JFK's Terminal 4 and to remove Officer Miller from public-facing duty immediately. Furthermore, Zenith Airlines is committing $5 million to a new fund to provide legal assistance to passengers who wish to file formal civil rights complaints. And finally, we will be installing our own passenger advocates in our top 5 Hubs Zenith employees whose sole job is to be present at security checkpoints, to observe, document, and assist our customers in real time. It was a stunning announcement. She hadn't just identified a problem. She had presented a comprehensive, fully funded solution. She had bypassed every internal obstacle and taken her case directly to the highest levels of government and public opinion. When the interview concluded, the boardroom was silent. The debate was over. The stock ticker crawling across the bottom of the news channel showed Zenith's stock ZTH trending upwards in after-hours trading. Marcus Thorne looked at the screen, then at the faces of his fellow board members. He saw no support. He saw no anger at Imani. He saw only the cold, hard calculation of businessmen who knew which way the wind was blowing. The ship had turned, and he was on the wrong side of the tide. The reckoning had arrived. For Officer Miller, it was public and immediate. For Marcus Thorne, it would be quieter, but no less final. The morning after the broadcast, Imani's team presented the Project Lighthouse dossier at DHS headquarters in Washington, D.C. They were not there to make demands. They were there to present a thick, undeniable file of evidence. Faced with a mountain of meticulously compiled data and the threat of a congressional firestorm, the officials acted swiftly. Within hours the news broke. The TSA had suspended Officer David Miller, pending a full investigation, and the DHS had launched a top-to-bottom review of screening procedures at JFK. The victory was absolute. For David Miller, the suspension was the beginning of the end. Stripped of his uniform and his power, his name and face were all over the news. The superiors who had once praised his vigilance now treated him like a pariah. The union's defense was half-hearted against the avalanche of evidence, and the internal investigation quickly confirmed a long-standing pattern of abuse. He was fired within the month. The hard karma he had so casually dealt out for years had finally come back to him, not with a whisper, but with a roar. The fallout for Marcus Thorne was less public, but just as decisive. The board of directors now saw Project Lighthouse for what it was, a masterstroke of marketing and public relations that had re-energized the brand. Thorne's obstructionism and leaks to the press painted a clear picture of a man whose judgment had failed the company. At the next board meeting, he was given a choice, a quiet resignation with a generous severance package, or a very public termination. He took the severance, and his reign of quiet sabotage was over. In the months that followed, Imani's vision became reality. Zenith's blue-vested passenger advocates became a common and welcome sight at security lines de-escalating tensions. The passenger Bill of Rights was posted at every counter, and the $5 million legal fund began helping travelers fill and win civil rights cases. Imani didn't just clean house. She redesigned it from the foundation up, proving a company could be both profitable and principled. About a year after she took the job, Imani was walking through JFK's Terminal 4. She still chose to fly commercial, a self-imposed mandate to stay connected to the reality of her customers. The terminal felt different. The undercurrent of anxiety at the security checkpoint had lessened. She saw a young family, the mother wearing a hijab being pulled aside for a secondary screening. One of Zenith's passenger advocates, immediately and calmly walked over. Imani watched as the advocate spoke quietly with the TSA agent, and the family explaining the procedure and ensuring their belongings were handled with respect. The interaction was professional, respectful, and humane. Imani smiled. This was the new standard. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. It was the legacy of a single humiliating moment that had been transformed through courage and conviction into a force for change. As she walked towards her gate, she knew with absolute certainty that Zenith Airlines was finally flying in the right direction. The story of Imani Jackson and David Miller is a stark reminder that true power isn't about a title or a uniform. It's about courage and accountability. A single act of prejudice intended to humiliate one person ended up exposing a systemic sickness. But it took a leader willing to risk everything to administer the cure. Imani didn't just fire a problem employee, she rebuilt the system that created him. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of karma and the importance of standing up for what is right, please hit that like button to help the algorithm share it with more people. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. And share this video with someone who needs to see that sometimes the ones who are wronged are the only ones who can make things right. Thank you for watching.